Welcome back to Letters of Intent, the show where we look at how risk, leverage, and incentives shape outcomes long before they show up in a deal.
Today, we're talking about commercial leases, not from the perspective of rent or square footage, but from the perspective of who actually bears the risk when things go sideways.
Today, we have our returning guest to the show, my good friend, Robby Pinnamaneni. Robby advises tenants on commercial leasing with a focus on how lease terms interact with lender rights, ownership changes, and capital structure. He's also been doing a lot of public-facing education lately through his new venture called Leasing Lawyers, breaking down risks tenants often don't realize they've accepted. It's a fantastic social media account. I would say follow it right now. So if you're looking to find it right now, you can just go to _the_leasing_lawyers on Instagram and find it. He's produced some great content that is really fun to watch. You're leveraging AI and a lot of fun tools to make it exciting and interesting, and also learn a little bit about leases at the same time. Robby, welcome back to the show, man.
Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you for having me. Sahil, always great to be back on your podcast. Love what you guys have done here.
I have to say, I am a follower of the Leasing Lawyers account, and I love the way you blend expertise and humor. There's a video where you've got two friends walking. I think it was a meme post. Two friends are walking and there's a guy dancing, and it's like a high-risk lease, and the client is abandoning his attorney to go dance with this person and then kicks a drink in the attorney's face. I thought that was so funny and so accurate. I want to just kick this off just by asking, how often do you feel like that happens, that you're trying to protect your clients from themselves?
Well, first things first, and I learned this from Pankaj years ago. I got to give credit when credit's due. So I have a great guy, Raj Suri, who's been helping me kind of convey my stories and my message into kind of fun ways. So he's the brainchild behind that video. But I think as attorneys, Sahil, like we can all appreciate when we have a client, particularly now with AI and ChatGPT out there, that doesn't want to take our advice, that thinks they kind of already know what's going on, thinks that they have the experience and they don't see the landmines in the way, and they want to kind of carve out their own path. So I think as attorneys, we've all dealt with that kind of client. But I think with leases, there's a lot higher risk, right? Like people tend to focus on the mundane. They think that as lawyers, we come in and focus on what is the rent number, and you don't need to pay a lawyer to negotiate what the rent number is.
Hey.
But there's so many other things that go into a lease well beyond rent that can have a higher impact that I think people often miss. And so that's what we're trying to get at with the Leasing Lawyers. We're trying to really get into what the documents are talking about, really helping the clients understand that these are more like credit documents or credit instruments where you need to understand like what you're getting into, similar to how if you were to get into a loan, what would those terms look like? And so
That
that's
is
how we're
such a
approaching
good
this.
point. I
Yeah.
have never thought of a lease as a credit instrument, but you're so right. It's a continuing obligation, and it comes with covenants just like a loan does. That's a very interesting way of looking at it. And it is complicated. I thought there was a very interesting video I saw that you shared, which was very useful. It was about HVAC,
Mhm.
and you gave your audience a very simple task, which was just search for HVAC and look for these provisions. And I thought that was very perceptive in terms of you're not forcing your audience or your clients to become attorneys, but you're giving them a practical approach to look at things that they wouldn't look at. Usually, like you're saying, people are looking at the price of the lease and that's it. No one's looking at the other obligations. You're breaking it down in a simple way. So I want to give you a scenario and see kind of how you approach this. A tenant signs a long-term lease, invests heavily in tenant improvement, and then learns years later that the landlord is in mortgage default. After foreclosure, the lease itself is suddenly vulnerable. Is this a situation that you see often? And why does this kind of situation surprise so many tenants?
Yeah, Sahil, great question. So we do see this a lot, and particularly like we see it in years when there's a big debt maturity wall happening. And so 2026, as you know, and we've talked about this at length, is one of those years where a lot of commercial debt is coming due. And what happens is, unless you have something called an SNDA, it's a subordination, non-disturbance, and a torment agreement in place, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means later, but we'll just say SNDA. Unless you have one of those in place, if your landlord defaults on their loan, then the lender will come in and take over the asset, and then they can just kick you out as the tenant. And so any tenant improvements that you put into the premises, any goodwill that you built in the location and kind of the premises, and whatever, if you have a retail store, location, all those things, they just go away. They go right out the window and you have no protection. And so that is a risk that tenants do face when they're not thinking about sort of these outside the box, outside the four corners of the lease agreement issues. and they need to diligence those to have that protection.
Yeah, and actually, Robbie, and one thing we look at a lot too is like we've done a decent amount of commercial leasing too. Like you and I actually have worked on a couple of really big leases here in LA in the past. What do tenants miss, or what don't they think about when they're first discussing like a commercial lease or trying to get into commercial lease here in LA? Or what are some often like some oversights they may just not even think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, like we talked about HVAC, right? Like HVAC is arguably one of the most expensive components to any property, right? And anyone who's bought a home or a condo is very well aware
Yeah.
of the risks that an HVAC can carry, but who has to maintain that? Who has to replace that? Has it been maintained over the years, or are you stepping into a lease where the landlord says now you're liable for replacement, but this thing has been in disrepair for many, many years, and so you're kind of coming in at the end of the useful life, and then you're stuck with a 5-figure bill or 6-figure bill, depending on the premises, replacing and maintaining an HVAC. So I think some of those maintenance obligations, some of the infrastructure obligations, I think tenants really need to pay attention to. And then going back to when we talked about landlord mortgage default, having an SNDA in place. And what an SNDA basically does, it says that if the landlord defaults on the loan and the lender steps in, the lender's agreeing to keep your lease in place. And so without an SNDA, the lender could just say, hey, you're out of here, get out of here. But if you have the SNDA in place, that means you're saying that your lease is subordinate to the lender's mortgage, which is what they want to their loan. And then the lender's saying conversely back to you, I'm going to make sure I'm not going to kick you out. And then the attornment part of it is basically saying if the lender does step in, that you're just going to pay them rent directly now. And so it sort of clears what would be otherwise muddy waters of what happens when that landlord defaults. And that's why, what we advise a lot of tenants now when you're doing diligence on a place, like understand like what does the landlord's balance sheet look like? What are their loan obligations? What is their financial health? Like what other exposure do they have going on? And that can kind of help you underwrite, what your risk is of being in that default scenario.
Yeah, and actually, that's a great point you make. And I think we see a lot of issues come up with like CAM and CAM calculations as well. HVAC is one of the big ones. I think that a lot of people don't just kind of glaze over, tenants glaze over if they don't have a lawyer involved or a competent lawyer involved. But I was going to ask, are there some make or break terms you can think of that you've actually advised clients to just walk away from the lease, saying, hey, you know what? This is just too much risk you're taking on. Maybe you don't want to do this deal.
I think there's a lot of times, like, let's talk about tenant improvements, right? Like, a lot of times people think the landlord's being generous. They're not being generous, right? It's effectively like a loan that the landlord's underwriting to you that you have to pay back, often with some premium or some interest over the life of the lease, right? And so you better be sure your business is going to last, right? Like if you owe X hundreds of thousands of dollars in TI improvements that are amortized over a certain time period and your business doesn't last that long, landlord might come after you for that kind of money, right? And so so you got to really start thinking about these things again as a credit document, as a loan document, because ultimately you're going to have to pay it back in some form or another with usually some form of interest.
Mm.
So I think tenant improvements is one. Personal guarantees. I think
Yeah,
a lot of commercial
it's a big
leases,
one.
as you know, require personal guarantees, but sometimes the terms can be very onerous and in off market. And so I think those are ones that tenants really need to be careful of. And I think just globally, and I think you and I have experienced this. I know we worked on some big leases in some of the big buildings in downtown LA early on. And a lot of people come to me and you and us, and they say, oh, well, this is just boilerplate. This is just boilerplate. And I hate that term.
Yeah.
Because I think the brokers have been very good about instilling this like mantra of boilerplate so that they can
Yeah.
close the deal and get their commission. And this isn't
Yeah.
a knock on brokers. They serve a
No,
very
but you make a good
yeah,
point. They're not your friend. They're not on
yeah,
your
yeah,
side,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
They're incentivized to get the deal done, and I don't feel like that's said enough. I mean,
yeah,
and again, yeah, I'm not knocking them, but that is where they're coming from. So you need
yeah.
to go in eyes wide open, right? Like
Eyes wide
it
open
bothers
and
me all the
yeah,
time
it's
that
it's eyes
yeah.
wide open and it's not just about getting the deal done. And I think that's where and that's why I think like what makes us like good deal lawyers is like, look, there's some lawyers where they just always woke up on the wrong side of the bed. They want to poo-poo every deal. They want to stop everything. They want to be the smartest person in the room. I think that's the bad kind of counsel, right? So I think like the lawyer has to find the balance between, yes, we need to get this deal done. Like this is what the client wants. Like we need to have the view of like, we're going to help you get this done. But then the other side of that is that this isn't boilerplate. It doesn't have to be boilerplate. We got to pick and choose our battles. We don't need to nitpick every single thing, but there are going to be some major things that we have to to work on and to modify. And so yeah, this whole boilerplate mantra is something that I think is super challenging to deal with sometimes, particularly in the lease context, right? Like a lot of times with other contracts, I think clients are used to, or they acknowledge that there's some negotiation room. For some reason, with leases in particular, people seem to think that they don't have any
Yeah.
leverage or opportunity to negotiate, which is just false.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually
So
just one other point on that is just, like, really when the boilerplate is, like, a euphemism oftentimes for, like, just don't ask about it or, like, whatever, like, they're trying to
yeah.
essentially gaslight you, which is
Yeah,
Yeah.
I see a lot. It was like they got, like, it's market, another term
yeah,
that they use, it's
yeah,
market, or this is
yeah,
standard. Like, whenever you hear those terms, your concern should go up. Like, the red
Yeah.
flag should be going up in your head. The light should be going on saying, "Hold on, let's pay attention to this," because oftentimes they're trying to cover up something that they don't want to discuss. And I think in counsel, like you, Robbie, us like we'll say, okay, hold on here. Let's ask about this. Why? Why is this market? Why is this boilerplate? What makes this boilerplate? Because oftentimes you can point to examples where it's not.
yeah. I think that's exactly right. And like some of the, kind of going back to Sahil's question on like some of the red flags, like we talked about sort of the tenant allowances. I think assignment and change of control. Like I had a client who has been trying to sell her business forever, and the assignment provision said that the landlord had sole discretion to approve it. And he just never approved it. Like he basically he squashed like 5 or 6 opportunities over a 9-year period to sell her business. Finally, at the 11th hour, he agreed to something, but it was at like a tenth of the value of like what her first offer was. And then he asked for money on the back end to approve the consent. And so she
Wow.
wasn't able to monetize her business at all.
Wow.
Right. She lost huge value because of an assignment or change of control provision. Another
Interesting.
area that I see a lot of issues is on the use provisions, permitted use. A lot of people forget that that's another boilerplate, but it's really not. Like if you have a very narrow permitted use, then if you need to down the line in your lease, you have a 10-year lease and you're like, hey, we need to offer this business now, or we need to kind of change to, with the times or economic times, you may not be able to change the use of what you're using that premises for if you have a very narrowly drafted permitted use section. And that also goes to subleasing, right? If you need at some point to get rid of part of your premises and cover, whatever your monthly expense is, like, do you have the opportunity to sublet? And if the answer is yes, does the sublessee have the right to do whatever they need to do there under the permitted use provisions? And so all of these things tend to tie into each other.
Absolutely.
I have a question. You talked about that business case where the tenant had a relationship with the landlord in terms of even the ability to sell their business. So sometimes we do see deals where somebody's business is tied into the landlord through some kind of commission agreement or a percentage of sales. How often do you see that? And do you ever advise against those kinds of deals or are you in favor of them? What makes that work where someone maybe has a retail shop and they're splitting profits with a landlord? When do you see that situation
Yeah,
happen
I
and
mean, I
do you
think
ever recommend it?
I think I've seen it a little less and less like over the years. You do see it. I think a couple of the flags are like, is this a highly regulated industry? Because a lot of times you can't do a revenue share in a highly regulated industry. And so I think a lot of landlords and tenants sometimes forget about that, like sharing in the profits or revenue of something where you need a specific license to
Like
operate that
healthcare
kind of
or like
business, right?
law. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think there's some issues there. From a landlord's perspective, it's like, why would I want to have to rely on auditing these people every month? And are they
Mm.
sending me the right numbers? And is this calculation right? Like it gets pretty onerous. So I'm not a huge fan. I mean, we do see them, but I think again, there's more than what you see on the surface, and you really need to underwrite like from both the landlord or the tenant perspective, like what are you getting into here? How can we really calculate or audit this? Is this a highly regulated business? There's a lot of factors that go into it.
So we talked a little bit about the red flags for tenants. Are there certain, not to say that there are, we were talking about boilerplate and how you can't treat things just as market. You got to look at what it's really going to cost you. But are there certain unavoidable costs for tenants? Is there a way that the responsibilities have been divided that are going to be very difficult to push away from the tenants these days?
Yeah, look, I think post COVID, we've seen it even in our own city here in Los Angeles, right? Like you look at Wilshire, you look at Melrose, you look at all these like iconic places where they're just empty, right? There's for rent signs, and the commercial leasing space has suffered significantly, and I think we're seeing some of it come back. But I think with that, tenants are getting a little bit more leverage. I think there's a little bit more negotiating leverage. I think landlords are willing to kind of come to the table and kind of bend on what would otherwise be quote unquote boilerplate years ago. And so I do think commercial tenants do have a little bit more leverage. Obviously it depends on the geography, but kind of in this post-COVID world right now, I think that market is still making a recovery.
I think there's a lot of issues with leasing going on today. And what do you, in the context of 2025, 2026, what we're seeing today, you mentioned a little bit about even landlords and buildings and issues with, potentially stressed properties, right? We're seeing so many vacancies nowadays. Are there opportunities you're seeing for people in commercial development, office space area that you think maybe people should be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, look, and great question. We've talked about this, and I think in any market, whether it's a stock market, real estate market, I think when things are in distress, it's the people with liquidity and cash that tend to prevail, right? Because they can come in and make strategic moves. And I think right now we're seeing in this real estate market, there is distress, even in the city of Los Angeles. A lot of multifamily, multi-unit developments are hitting debt maturity walls. Things are taking longer, things are more expensive. So I think what we're seeing is a lot of strategic investors that are coming in and buying mezzanine debt. And mezzanine debt is a layer of debt that sits between equity and mortgage debt. And basically, the way it works is you're not secured by a mortgage on the property. You're secured by a pledge of 100% of the equity interest in the entity that owns the property. And the advantage of that, and that's what mezzanine debt is. Advantage of that is when you want to foreclose, you don't need to go through a 12 to 18 month judicial foreclosure process. Mezzanine lender can use the UCC Article 9 and they can do a foreclosure in 60 to 90 days. So it's much less protracted, it's much more straightforward, and it's less costly than a traditional judicial foreclosure. And then within the mezzanine capital stack, there's the intercreditor agreement, and that governs the relationship between the different layers of debt on the property. And if you have a good and properly negotiated intercreditor agreement, as a mezzanine debt holder, you're collecting default interest, you're getting current pay interest while the sponsor is trying to figure things out. And then ultimately, if they can't figure things out, you get the keys to the kingdom. You get the property at usually cents on the dollar. So we've seen Wall Street do this. We're seeing people do this more on the localized level, like I said, at these multi-unit developments in the city of Los Angeles and other localities where you can come in, buy mezzanine debt, get the rights that you want vis-a-vis this intercreditor agreement, go through a UCC Article 9 foreclosure versus a traditional judicial foreclosure, and then you're getting property at cents on the dollar, and you're just capturing all the upside. And so these are very strategic moves. Very sophisticated investors kind of play in this arena, but I think there's an opportunity for more localized investors to get involved as well.
So just a follow-up question on that, because that is very interesting. Who has priority then? Let's say the property does go into foreclosure. You've got the mortgage company has secured the property itself, and you're saying the mezzanine debt has secured the company itself. So ultimately, who gets the property if things go sideways?
So the mezzanine, if you look at it like in a line, you have the property, and then above the property is the mezzanine debt holder, and above that is the senior mortgage holder, right? And so the mezzanine, they can foreclose, and this all depends on what the intercreditor agreement says. So, but assuming the ICA sort of like lends itself to this scenario that I'm describing, the mezzanine debt holder can foreclose, they get control of the property, but it's subject to the senior mortgage. So they you can't just extinguish the senior mortgage. Right. It's just that they now have taken over the property at cents on the dollar, and then
Right.
they're paying the senior mortgage as the new quote unquote property owner. So
Right.
you can't eliminate the debt that's sort of quote unquote senior to you, but you can gain control of the asset at cents on the dollar through a fairly quick process, and then you're subject to the senior loans.
Got it.
Okay,
You're
subject
stepping into
to.
the shoes
Interesting.
of the
Yeah.
owner.
Interesting.
So in that case, well, kind of to pivot now from the potential landlord side to a tenant side, if a tenant is signing a lease today, what would they be underwriting besides the space itself?
Great question. So I think really you want to look at ultimately the balance sheet of the landlord, right? If you can, you want to understand like what is their exposure? Do they have a lot of debt? Are they servicing a lot of debt? What's their financial health? You want to understand kind of all those different things. I think you also want to understand like the maintenance records related to the property. Have the major components been maintained? Have there been inspections done? The components like the HVAC, how new are they? Are they under warranty? All these types of things I think you're going to want to look at. But really it's understanding what is the position of the landlord, right? And
Yeah.
if they're going to foreclose, or if they're in a situation where they're servicing a lot of debt, that's going to affect like the amount of the tenant allowance that you're getting and the terms of that. That's going to affect the personal guarantees that they're requiring. Usually there's going to be more onerous personal guarantees if the landlord's under a lot of pressure. And then as we talked about earlier, I think having an SNDA in place and being eyes wide open with that is going to be really important.
Yeah, Robbie, I mean, I love that you said this because this is so important and I think a little bit counterintuitive because oftentimes people, if you're looking to rent a space, it's landlords asking the tenant for a bunch
Yeah.
of information, right?
Yeah.
They're asking the tenant to be,
Yeah.
show us all the financials, show us that you're credit worthy, show us that you're
Yeah.
not going to default. But really, the sophisticated people out there should be asking the landlord the same question, right? It's like
Yeah.
you guys are getting into a relationship, right? You're not just one side's asking the other party for something. Both sides should be asking people for things. And you're right. And I think, oftentimes things I mention off the bat is even at the LOI stage is like, I mean, think about speaking of letters of intent, where they really need to be asking for 3 years of CAM, right? They need to
Yeah.
be asking for like, history and
Yeah.
historical data, like you're saying.
Historical. Yeah. What is
Yeah, all
historical?
this.
What has it
Yeah,
been? What are you stepping into? Those types of things. Like, and then kind of going back to highly regulated industries, like, we've represented a couple cannabis clients over the
yeah,
year, and cannabis manufacturing and production uses a lot of power and water. And
yeah,
so they have these
absolutely.
huge outstanding LEDWP bills that haven't been paid for years. And then a new tenant wants to step in and they want to do something at that property. And now maybe LEDW saying, well, we're not going to do anything with you because,
Yeah,
there's this huge bill that's like in arrears. And so,
right.
there's a lot of different nuances that come up depending on what the industry is, but you are entirely correct that I think diligence has to go both ways. It's no longer this phase of this beauty contest of the tenant trying to impress the landlord. I think the landlord also has to impress the tenant.
Absolutely, absolutely. That should be something we need to bookmark and use
Yeah.
for our social,
Yeah,
you
we gotta
know,
make t-shirts. Yeah.
That honestly, that's the main takeaway for me from this conversation is you're absolutely right. I've always thought about the landlord evaluating the tenant, and there are so many things that can go wrong if the tenant doesn't evaluate the landlord. This is really, really helpful advice to anyone who is looking to get into that kind of a relationship. This concept, I think, Robbie, that you've introduced, this idea that the lease is a credit instrument, that is really powerful. And I think that feels like a mindset shift that tenants need to adopt before heading into their next lease. If you had to advise a tenant before going into a negotiation, what is the single biggest mindset shift you think tenants need to make before getting into the next lease?
I think really it's like getting away from the hyper focus on rent. Obviously that matters, but you got to start thinking optionality, right? What if I need a different use over the years? What if I need less space? Like, do I have any contraction rights in the lease? What if I want to sell my business? What if I want to sublease part of it? What if I want to assign part of it? Really, it's looking at what are my options like in this 5, 10, 15, 20-year marriage that I'm going to enter into here. Not just being hyper focused on like what is the rent over the, in month X and what is the escalation from year to year. Like obviously those terms are important, but again, you don't need to be a lawyer to know those terms. Like you can go and see what that number is and you can
Yeah.
run your numbers to see whether it makes financial sense. But it's the optionality where I see people really miss the boat.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. That's super, super valuable advice. And then lastly, I wanted to, before we end, I wanted to talk a little bit more about your foray now into social media as being an influencer of the leasing world, probably
Yes,
one of the only leasing lawyer influencers
Yeah.
out there.
that's right.
Tell us a little bit more about like why you feel this public education is so important and how you've approached kind of getting this message out there.
It's really because, and it kind of touches on what we mentioned earlier, is like traditionally, I think people look at leases as like a pretty one-dimensional document, hyper-focused on like rent and square footage, boilerplate, right, as we talked about. And the more and more I've represented stakeholders throughout the lease process, like these documents are very, very interesting. As we noted, they're like credit documents, and they really kind of describe and lay out what is your business going to look like over 1, 5, 10, 15 years, and what are my options, right? And so I think like it's for me, I've just been fascinated on how the lease really does govern what a business optionality and ultimately exit can look like. For example, like let's say I have a dental practice and I want to sell to private equity. I've seen a lot of those deals get devalued because the lease didn't have proper change of control or assignment provisions. Or, for
Mm,
example, the dentist also owned the real estate, but chose not to have an arm's length lease between the real estate entity and the operating entity. And private equity will discount that on evaluation, right? So these
mhm.
documents can get very complicated, and there's a lot of nuanced implications that come from them. And so I've always been fascinated by that. And again, we touched on the whole mezzanine debt and that whole situation there. And while that's more related to property ownership, that's again very interesting to me how in a distressed situation, someone can be a strategic investor and get involved in real estate. Usually people don't think about that. They just think about buying something for X and selling it for X plus Y, but they're not really thinking about getting in the middle of the capital stack and foreclosing and timing and economics and default interest and all those things. So whether it's real estate acquisitions and disposition or whether it's commercial leasing, there's so much underneath the first dimension of these documents, and that's what I find really fascinating.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, this has been great. I taking notes here too. So I think this has been a fantastic conversation. Robbie, you're always a wealth of information in real estate and leases, and also you have a lot of operational experience in different industries like cannabis and other areas. So I think you have a lot of really great insights that I think a lot of our listeners could use as they're thinking about leasing and also real estate. If you guys want to find out more, Robbie, where can people find you?
Yeah, they can find us at theleasinglawyers.com or on Instagram at theleasinglawyers underscore or always through Carbon Law Group as well. I work closely, obviously, with you guys and consider you guys more than colleagues, also family and close friends. So people can find me through any of those avenues.
For our listeners, leases don't just define space, they define who absorbs risks and capital structures as they change. Sahil, any parting words as we end this?
Well, I just want to say this has been very, very helpful. Robbie, you are our real estate expert. I know that you have been very helpful to so many Carbon clients. So, for everyone listening, make sure you subscribe to the Leasing Lawyers and make sure that you took some notes from this conversation. I know I've learned a lot. And for all of you listening, thank you again for listening to Letters of Intent. We will see you next time.